This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
The conflict in Ukraine is dragging on without an end in sight. What can be done to achieve peace? Hello, I'm Anton Fedyashin, and this is The Heat. Ukraine says Russia has been targeting Ukrainian power infrastructure with missile strikes. The West has responded with economic sanctions, imposing a price cap on Russian oil. The Kremlin said the move would destabilize the world's economy and vowed retaliation. We begin with this report from Stuart Smith in Moscow.
It's been months in the making, a set of measures designed to impact where it hurts the most, Russia's biggest source of income, oil. The EU and some G7 countries have stopped importing Russian oil by sea to deprive Russia of some revenue. And this sixth round of sanctions being implemented now means EU ships sailing to any destination or insured by EU brokers are not allowed to ship the oil of the world's second largest exporter, unless it's being sold for less than $60. That means most of the world's insurers are unavailable to Russia, as well as a big chunk of the global tanker fleet. The price cap, in theory, means Russia would still profit from exporting oil, but not by as much as it could have. And the West avoids being responsible for a major oil market shock, which would further increase inflation and hurt consumers. But the expectation is buyers not part of the price cap, like India or China, will still bargain for lower prices, knowing the cap exists and Russia has few alternatives.
Russia has been crazy successful in diverting its oil export. For example, 3/4 of Russian export of crude oil to North Europe has already been reverted to Asian nations, mostly India. Some countries in the Middle Eastern region of the world are also eager to buy Russian oil to refine, to make oil products out of it, and then they can sell these products even to Europe. They can do many things. They can blend Russian oil with oil from other producers.
To evade the price cap, Russia's been assembling a fleet of old ships and has attempted to find alternative insurers. But Western legislators know that will add additional costs for Russia. Ultimately, nations that have joined the oil price cap hope Moscow's costs go up and its profits come down, leading it to rethink the value of its so-called special military operation in Ukraine. That's the theory, but there's huge uncertainty about what an oil price cap will actually do to the oil market. The OPEC Plus group of oil producers is taking a wait-and-see approach before calling on its members to fill the gap left by lost production in Russia. For now, leaders here don't know if that'll be required, but Moscow says it will produce less oil if needed. And it insists there's plenty enough funds to keep the economy going, including for its so-called special military operation in Ukraine. Experts say it may take months to see whether the G7 EU plan is working, just before another blow for Russia when a similar EU ban comes into force for Russian oil products like diesel. For now, Russia remains confident it can ride all of this out. Stuart Smith, CGTN, Moscow.
To discuss what's next for Ukraine, let's bring in our guests. Pavlo Kukhta is a former Ukrainian acting minister of economic development, and he joins us from Kyiv. Anton Fedyashin is a professor of history at American University right here in Washington, D.C. Also in D.C., Becker is the executive director of the Answer Coalition, and Klaus Larres is a professor of history and international affairs at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Thank you all for joining us. Klaus Larres, the Western-led opposition to Russia has imposed several rounds of sanctions against Russia. This latest round of sanctions includes this oil price cap. None of those sanctions so far have stopped the conflict, nor have they forced Russia to the negotiating table. Do you think this latest round will make a difference?
Probably not that much. It is really the attempt to square the circle, to not deprive the oil markets, the international oil markets of oil, but at the same time to cut down on the profits Russia makes from selling its oil. I don't think that it will bring Russia to the negotiating table, but it will certainly make life very hard and harder for Russia. Whether it will work, as your reporter said, we will only find out in the next few months. But what it does show is that the Western world is still united in punishing and penalizing Russia for its aggressive war against Ukraine. Because to bring so many nations together behind that oil cap and also ban Russian seaborne oil to the European Union, that is quite an achievement, and it took several months to get there, but it shows that the Western world is still united to make sure that Russia does not benefit from its war of aggression against Ukraine.
Right, Klaus, you say it'll bring hardship to Russia, but doesn't it also bring a level of hardship and also uncertainty to the consumers, to nations in Europe that consume Russian oil? And the last thing that those nations need is uncertainty in the energy markets.
Absolutely. You know, everyone is suffering from the war, from Russia's war against Ukraine, and the EU has shown its willingness to suffer the consequences by punishing Russia. We know that there's a deep energy crisis in Europe and everywhere in the Western world, but particularly in Europe. But so far, European countries, European governments, and the European population, despite some protests, have stuck with that policy, have been committed to not give in to Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. And I think it is, of course, we don't know whether that will last, but so far, and the war has been going on since February, but so far that united Western front has really held.
Okay. Anton Fedyashin, how will these new sanctions, this oil price cap, impact Russia?
Well, I think it is going to create some problems for the Russians in terms of the amount that they're exporting. But it's worth remembering that this has been telegraphed for months now. So the Russians have already prepared themselves for this inevitability. So I'm sure that they have set up multiple alternate routes. Your package in the beginning mentioned the amount of tankers that they've purchased already in order to run them to deliver oil themselves. The Chinese, the Indians will continue to buy. So I think that the short-term impact on Russia will be felt, but it won't be sufficiently hard to actually change the calculus in the Kremlin. What interests me more even are the long-term impacts of this. And there are two sort of broad areas that I think are going to be very interesting to watch over the next few months and years. First of all, OPEC's reaction. OPEC hasn't made any immediate decisions in reaction to the cap. They're taking a wait-and-see attitude, as your journalist mentioned. But OPEC cannot possibly like this this general trend of events, because to every OPEC member, the attempted creation of a buyer's cartel is exactly what OPEC does not want to see. And I imagine that this will create an even closer relationship between Russia and the standard members of OPEC. And the other sort of broad trend that's going to be worth following is the future of the energy insurance market. One of the most powerful tools that the West, that Europe specifically has in its toolbox, is the fact that they can block insurance for tankers that are not European. Now, this has been the case, by the way, for a century now. Great Britain specifically has had a sizable monopoly on the insurance market. I think those days are beginning to come to an end, because all countries that can afford to run their own insurance for oil, gas, everything else will start doing precisely that.
Okay, Anton, two things. One, what if Russia says, look, okay, then we stop selling oil? And two, we've already heard the Indian foreign minister say, just after a meeting with the visiting German foreign minister, that India will continue to do business with Russia.
Anand, exactly. The Russians have said that they'll stop selling oil to whoever abides by the cap, and I think they're going to, at least in the beginning, abide by that promise. And they will simply redirect their flows elsewhere, to India and China first and foremost. And I think what's going to end up happening, which is already happening with natural gas, is that the Europeans will end up buying the same Russian oil, but for a higher price, which will only contribute to the tough times that Europe is facing economically.
Right. Brian, Becker, what do you make of NATO countries and their allies continuing to impose sanctions on Russia at a time when Europe itself is facing a lot of hardship. I mean, we look at it, it's high inflation, an energy crisis, street protests, yet the policy continues to be one of confrontation rather than resolution.
Right, and I think we have to look at the way this war started. What was the path to the war? Because if we're serious about talking about a path to peace, and of course I think the people in Europe, of course the people in Ukraine first and foremost, and probably most people in Russia want to find a path to peace. Economic sanctions will punish Russia. Will it stop Russia? No. How did we get here? NATO expansion in 1999, 2004, 2009, and again in 2020, and the decision by Antony Blinken and Jake Sullivan and the Biden administration to absolutely refuse to negotiate when Russia was saying, look, we have red lines, we demand that Ukraine be neutral, and the U.S. said back to Russia, look, you don't tell us who can come into NATO, and you don't tell Ukraine whether they can join NATO or not. Your demands are non-starters. So now we have sending more weapons to Ukraine, more economic sanctions on Russia, which is going to make life much harder for the people all over the Eurasian landmass. And that's not the path to peace. That's not going to stop the war. If you want to stop the war, you have to go back to the negotiating table, thinking that you're going to punish Russia by these sanctions such that Russia will come back and do something like allow NATO to expand right up to its border. That's a fantasy. And I'm really sad that people who are talking about this as if the people in Europe and Ukraine are just pawns in some big geostrategic chessboard don't realize that the urgent need is real peace, and the only way to get to real peace is to have real negotiations.
Pavlo, Kukhta, let's talk about the situation in Ukraine itself. Russian missile strikes have been targeting Ukrainian infrastructure, particularly energy infrastructure. Electric infrastructure has been hit. That's led to widespread power cuts. It's knocked out heating units. Even water supplies have been hit in Ukraine as well. And this is happening at a time when temperatures are dropping, when winter is beginning to take a pretty firm grip in that region. Can you give us a sense of what life is like right now?
Yes, actually, the latest missile strike has been several hours ago. This was after a pause of about 1.5 weeks, which was pretty long for them. Seemingly, they are running out of missiles, or at the very least, they have to conserve them, which is quite likely given how many they've expanded already. Now, I am quite happy to tell you that this strike was quite ineffective. So most of the missiles were shut down. I'm now in Kiev. Kiev usually is targeted one of the heaviest. Today, our interior defenses worked admirably. All of the missiles were shut down. No power outages in Kiev at all. Odessa was hit pretty hard. That's the port town in the south. That was the worst. There, the electricity and even water supply got turned off, but I believe by morning they will all be reinstated. So all in all, it's been a lose for Russia, this latest missile strike. Hopefully this will be the trend to continue, because this was one of their tools of pressure in Ukraine, and finally we are armed enough to fully defend ourselves from this, then this is over. Their missile terror campaign will be over with.
So do you believe that Ukraine will be able to endure more strikes from Russia in the foreseeable future?
It is always very hard to estimate. It's essentially a battlefield, albeit a very sophisticated and technological battlefield. But this latest strike has me hopeful. Yeah, we've managed it pretty well.
Klaus, Larres, the French President Emmanuel Macron, he was in Washington just a few days ago. He held talks with President Biden. And shortly after those talks, President Biden said that, look, he's prepared to talk to the Russian President Vladimir Putin. He attached some conditions to those talks, and he also said that he will not talk to Vladimir Putin in a bilateral meeting, but would consult with NATO allies as well. I mean, is there an opportunity there, a window of opportunity for some kind of negotiation?
I wish there was, of course, and I think it's a good sign that President Biden has offered to talk to Putin. But there are various problems here, and one problem is that we don't know what Putin's war aims are, actually. So what does Putin still want to achieve? And I think no one really knows, but perhaps Putin himself. Then, of course, there are the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians have said they do not wish to give up any of their territory. They wish to obtain their full sovereignty again, as they used to have it. So Putin would need to give up the territory he has conquered since February of this year. But generally,
Klaus, just one thing.
Is good and sensible.
Just one point, Klaus. You say we don't know what Putin wants. Isn't that the point of negotiations?
To find out, perhaps, yes. But we know, for example, from the Ukrainians that they, of course, want to get rid of all the Russian forces on their territory. So their goals are pretty clear. We don't really know what are Putin's goals, because initially he wanted to conquer Kiev, he wanted to conquer most of Ukraine. Then it was said he wanted to be happy with eastern Ukraine. Now he has been pushed back out of most of eastern Ukraine, or a large part of eastern Ukraine. So we really don't know what he wants to achieve. He is now hitting Ukrainian infrastructure, civilian infrastructure, the power grid. These are not military war aims. That is, these are measures to demoralize the Ukrainian population. So we really don't know what Putin is after, what he really wants, because all his original war aims of conquering Ukraine, of putting in a puppet government in Kiev, all that is highly unrealistic and not possible anymore. And we really don't know how his shifting goals can be explained and what his shifting goals are, really.
Anton Fedyashin, President Biden says he's open to talks with President Putin. But what's the view from the Kremlin? Is there any appetite for talks from there?
Well, I think there is appetite for talks. It's just a question of what's going to be talked about. So far, what we've seen from the West is sort of television diplomacy and occasionally Twitter diplomacy, but no one's actually taken any steps to sit down and begin serious negotiations, which, by the way, I agree with you and partially with what Klaus just said. The beginning of the negotiations will be figuring out exactly what the Russians want. But we already have, by the way, something of a blueprint, and that those were the points that the Russians had submitted to the United States back in December and January of last year. Neutral status for Ukraine, new common security structure for Europe. All of this will probably be brought up again. The toughest part, of course, for the Ukrainians will be the question of a territorial settlement.
Brian Becker, looking at that visit by Emmanuel Macron to Washington, and I'm wondering about the timing of the Biden announcement, right after that announcement that he's prepared to talk with Putin, and what the message was from Macron to Biden. I mean, did Macron come here and say, look, this alliance is fracturing, it's in danger? In fact, he did use the words. He says, you know, Russia has the ability to fragment the West.
Right. I do think that's exactly what's happening. I think when we talk about why the war happened, again, this goes really to the U.S. policy towards Europe, not only to Ukraine and not only to Russia. But I think you could see a lot of fracturing and unhappiness in Europe because of U.S. government policy shifts over the past few years. I mean, when Trump ripped up the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action for Iran, that hurt Europe. I mean, Europe was meant to suffer so that the U.S. government could renege on its earlier commitments during the Obama era. Then Biden came in and didn't really reset the JCPOA, and then is insisting that Europe basically suffer the costs of a confrontation, a very aggressive anti-Russia confrontational position that the Biden administration struck right from the beginning with Antony Blinken and Jake Sullivan. It wasn't just Russia, it was also with China. But this hyper-aggressive policy has actually hurt Europe. And I think what the Biden administration has to contend with is, will Europe start to actually stand up and say to the U.S., look, there is a path to peace. There is an opportunity for genuine negotiations. Ukraine could be a neutral country. NATO doesn't have to endlessly expand. These are achievable goals. And if, in fact, the U.S. did that, Russia would be at that negotiating table. What does Russia want? That's what they want. They've made it very clear what they wanted when they said these are red lines, and the U.S. government said, well, your demands are non-starters, and the U.S. government predicted that they would invade, but there was no sense of alarm. There was like, okay, they're going to invade. Why not say, if they're going to invade, if it's that big of a deal, and if Russia knows it will be evicted from the world economy, meaning it'll pay a heavy price, why not sit at the negotiating table and talk about a real security plan that gives Russia a guarantee that U.S. won't be placing advanced missiles on the Russian border?
Pavlo, President Zelensky's position on negotiations is that Russia needs to withdraw its troops from all those parts of Ukraine that it currently occupies. The Kremlin has ruled that out. But given the situation right now, can President Zelensky continue to stick to what the Russians are calling a maximalist position?
Look, so far the war is ongoing. Russians are not negotiating. Let's be clear about that. And they're slowly losing territories, region after region, right? They've lost parts of Kharkiv region. Now they lost Kherson region. We will see what happens next. I mean, war is unpredictable, but generally the Ukrainian army is advancing. And that has been the trend since spring. My firm belief is that Russia by now has already lost this war. The question is, when does it end? How much more suffering does it bring, and how exactly the end is negotiated? Yes, I believe, and it's not the President Zelensky's personal position. I mean, Ukraine is a democracy. He represents the people. It's the people's position that Ukraine has to regain its territories, and I understand, I think you all understand where this is coming from.
Right.
Now, how in fact it will play out will, I mean, first play out on the battlefield and then on the negotiating table. This is what we will see in the coming few months. I mean, me personally, and I'm sure every Ukrainian, would of course want this to end as soon as possible. But again, I mean, Russia is a bully. It's a great power that has gone rabid. It has made huge mistakes that are irresponsible for a great power.
Okay.
And it has to be punished for this. As simple as that. It has to pay the consequences, face the consequences of its actions.
Right, Pavlo, if, as you say, Russia has lost this war, why aren't there any negotiations taking place right now?
I think there are, in a way. I mean, we are seeing certain exchanges for the last months, kind of public, mostly public, through the media, as was said, Twitter diplomacy. I'm pretty sure some undercover, under the table consultations are taking place, though maybe and probably not between Ukraine and Russia directly.
Right.
But again, you know, this kind of diplomacy is quite complex. So it is slowly ongoing.
Yeah. Klaus, Larres, one other quick point on negotiations in view of what Brian Becker just told us a moment ago and on the situation in Europe. Last week, the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, he had talks with President Putin. These were talks that were initiated by Berlin, and he told President Putin, that a diplomatic solution must be reached as soon as possible. So that begs the question, which way are the political winds blowing in Germany?
No, I think the German people, like the European people, also I believe the American people and the Ukrainians, of course, would like to see a quick end to the war as soon as possible. But of course, the conditions need to be right. And as Mr. Becker just said, you know, we cannot just pretend that the war never happened, that Russia's invasion never happened. Maybe a neutrality solution would have been the right way to go before the war actually began. But now, after 9 months of war, longer than that, of brutal war and hits against the Ukrainian civilian population, you know, we cannot just pretend that that all never happened. We can go to the negotiating table as if that war of aggression had not happened. So I think that needs to be taken into account, and Russia needs to make clear concessions. Above all, territorial concessions. It needs to withdraw from Ukrainian territory. I think personally the Crimea question probably should be negotiated. There should be room for maneuver here, but not regarding the rest of Ukraine. Russia really needs to leave that territory. But so far, I cannot see any willingness on Putin's part to actually go and offer something like that. And as long as that isn't happening, and as long as the Ukrainians are making making actually military advances, and they still have the upper hand, so a slow upper hand in the war. I cannot see that negotiations, unfortunately, can produce any concrete result.
Okay. Anton Fedyashin, Ukrainian membership of NATO was one of the main reasons for these hostilities that emerged between Ukraine and Russia. Do you see any scenario where Russia would accept Ukrainian membership of NATO as part of an overall, a wider peace deal?
No, unfortunately, I don't. And the Russians have been abundantly clear about this. And it's not like they've simply said no and offered no alternative. They've offered alternatives on several occasions. The last time, and most seriously, when Dmitry Medvedev was president back in 2009, they offered an alternative security structure for all of Europe, actually the whole transatlantic world, with them included. But I think that leaving NATO and bringing Ukraine into it and then adding some kind of quota to this is really not going to fly. So I think this is going to have to be a philosophical rethinking of entire Atlantic structure, and it's going to be tough work. But then again, that's what professional and smart diplomats are for.
Right. Brian Becker, to get some idea of what the thinking is in the United States, the RAND Corporation, which is a think tank which is based here in Washington, D.C., and I should add that it gets the bulk of its funding from a multitude of United States government agencies as well as arms dealers in the United States. One of its experts said that even if Russia gets to keep Ukrainian territory, it has already lost the war because of the damage to its military and its reputation. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think the RAND Corporation and many of these think tanks that are associated with the military-industrial complex have a big incentive for endlessly talking about war, promoting war, talking against negotiations, talking with great bravado. I mean, war is big business, let's face it, in the United States. When you have $1 trillion military budget, when the U.S. fought in Vietnam, it elicited a massive anti-war movement. Same with Iraq. I helped lead that movement. But if you have Ukrainians and Russians killing each other, there's no political price to pay at home, but there's a great profit to be made. And that's what we're witnessing. This is a win-win situation for the military-industrial complex and for the war makers in Washington of both parties, because big business and war manufacturers make tons of money. The taxpayers pay for it.
Right.
It's for a noble cause, war, and Americans aren't dying, so there's no political blowback at home. That's the terrible tragedy and the cynicism of this policy.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.
This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
The nature of business is to bring value. Business activities in Europe, Asia, and the U.S. reach consumers globally. Trade, manufacturing, energy, high-tech, real estate, consumption. We give an expanded view on global business and how it covers, influences, or relates to the whole world. Global Business, only on CGTN.